Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey, and here is a free complete course on making a game from start to finish. If you've always wanted to learn how to make a game, or if you already know the basics but want to see how to organize a more complex project, then this video is for you. It's perfect for both beginners and more intermediate users. This is a completely free course video, but it has the same level of quality as my paid courses or my Steam games. You can download the project files to follow along or inspect the final game. You can even play the final game directly on Steam. We're going to start completely from scratch and build a really awesome game with tons of systems and mechanics. Building this design requires working with lots of Unity and C# features, so this is a really awesome project for you to learn. After following this course and learning all of these techniques, you will be able to build all kinds of games in all kinds of genres. This is going to involve learning about the basics of Unity and C#, learning how to make a character controller, physics raycasts, learn all about C# interface and events, using scriptable objects, handling UI, the new input system, and lots more. Very importantly, everything that we're going to do here is going to be focused on writing good, easy to understand, clean code. Meaning that I will not be teaching you bad practices that some beginner tutorials teach. The code that we're going to write here is production quality code. This is not a throwaway demo. The quality of the code and the structure of the game that we're going to build is on the same level of quality as my own Steam games. As you can see from the video link, this is indeed a complete, very thorough course, so don't try to watch this whole thing in one sitting. Take your time, take it slow, and just focus on learning. There are chapters for every single lecture in the video. Here's a quick overview of the entire course, all the steps that we're going to take to reach the final polished game. So first of all, we're going to start completely from scratch by selecting a Unity version and creating a brand new project. With that new project, we will then learn all about the basics of the Unity interface and set up a layout. Then the other important part is Visual Studio, which is where we're going to be writing all of our code. After that comes an extremely important lecture all about coding style and naming rules. Like I said, the code in this course is on the same level of quality as my Steam games, so having proper naming rules and good code style is paramount. Next, we're going to download and import all the assets that we're going to use in the course. Everything is included so you can follow along with every step of the way. With the assets imported, we're going to set up some quick post-processing just to make the game look good. Then for our first piece of logic, we're going to make a simple character controller. With that logic working, we will then implement a proper character visual with the included assets. Next, we're going to learn the basics of animation and the animator component. And with that, we're going to make our player really come alive with some simple but really nice animations. Then we're going to install the Cinemachine package. This isn't actually used too much in this course, but I still wanted to include it because it is such a useful tool, so I do want you to know about it. After that comes another extremely important lecture with regards to writing some good clean code. We're going to do a nice refactor to replace the legacy input manager with the brand new input system. Learning how to refactor is an extremely important and very valuable skill that will massively improve the quality of your code. With that done, we're going to implement some nice collision detection to make sure our character doesn't walk through walls. Next, we're going to create the very first kitchen counter and make a script to handle how to interact with it. Then we're going to learn all about C# events and create a proper interact input. Next, we're going to build a selected counter visual, which will require us to learn about the extremely useful singleton pattern. With the counters working, we're going to start working on the kitchen objects themselves. So these are going to be the ingredients and the plates. We're going to use scriptable objects to define all of the types. Then a very important part of our design is each kitchen object will have to be placed somewhere, so we're going to take some time to really think about the best way to achieve that, all while writing some good clean code. Next, we're going to enable the player to pick up an object. In doing so, we're going to learn about C# interfaces. Then we're going to make a container counter. This is from where we can spawn new objects. With that, we will enable the player to pick up objects and drop them anywhere where there's space. Then we're going to make the cutting counter. This one enables the player to cut an ingredient into slices. So to do that, we're going to make an alternate interact action. And for handling the cutting, we're going to once again use scriptable objects to define a proper cutting recipe. Then we're going to learn about a really awesome Unity feature, World Canvases, and use that to display a nice progress bar for our cutting progress. After that is a quick lecture, just going to make a very useful generic script to make any object look at the camera. Next, for another counter, we're going to build a trash bin. This is where the player can drop objects to destroy them. Then the stove counter. This one is going to be quite a bit complex. We're going to create recipes for cooking and for burning. We're going to learn how to make a basic state machine and handle timers. Next, we're going to make the plates counter. This is a simple counter that just spawns a bunch of plates. After that, we're going to make some custom logic on the plate to be able to hold other objects. With that logic working, we're going to build a complete visual for all the objects that can exist on the plate. Then make a nice UI element on the plate itself to showcase the icons of what exactly is on that plate. Afterwards, we're going to make the very last counter, the delivery counter. This is where we drop the completed plates. And in this lecture, we're also going to learn about the Unity shader graph and make a quick, simple custom shader. Then we're going to build the delivery manager class that generates the recipes that the customers are requesting. Next, we're going to build a UI to showcase the waiting recipes. After that comes something pretty crucial. We're going to add some music and then add some sound effects for all kinds of game actions. With that, the game will be almost done. So next, we're going to build a proper game start and a game end. Then make a simple main menu and handle scene loading. After that, handle creating a basic pause window. Then make an options menu, enable the player to modify the audio levels and rebind keys. After that, we're going to enable menu navigation with a controller. And in the end, as usual, comes the polish stage. So we're going to add all kinds of small tweaks and effects to make the game feel really great. Like I've said many times, polish is what separates good games from great games. After all of that, we will have our final completed project. So as you can see, you will learn about tons of topics by following this course. Also, let me point out, one of the reasons why I chose this specific design is because my next free course will be on taking the game that we're going to build here and make it multiplayer. So if you've ever wanted to make multiplayer games, then that course will be excellent for you. Definitely take your time following this course. The multiplayer free course should hopefully be out next month, or if you're watching this in the future, check the links in the description. Although that multiplayer video won't be starting from where this course ends, so definitely make sure you watch this one. Now, if you're new to the channel, then welcome, and here's a bit about me and my credentials, or why you should listen to what I have to teach. My name is Hugo, and I've been running this CodeMonkey YouTube channel for 5 years now. In total, almost 700 videos on all kinds of topics, including tons of tutorials sharing my knowledge to help you on your game dev journey. I'm also a professional indie game developer, making games for over 10 years with 8 successful games published on Steam, so what I'm teaching here is based on a lot of years of experience making a lot of games. Just like with my paid courses, I'm always going to be in the comments answering questions, so if you get stuck at a particular point or need extra clarification on something, go ahead, post a comment and I'll do my best to help. Do make sure you include a timestamp of what you're referring to. I will also be updating the pinned comment with any frequently asked questions that I see, so actually right now go ahead, pause the video and scroll down a bit just to look at that comment. Since on YouTube I cannot update the video after it's published, I will be updating that comment over the next months and years with anything that comes up. Also, I've been running this channel for 5 years, and in that time I've made almost 700 videos, so there's lots of topics that I've covered separately in more detail. All of those videos are linked in the description. Throughout this course, I will be focused on building this specific game using whatever it takes to build it, meaning, for example, when we get to using C# events, I will teach the basics about how they work in order to achieve what we want to build, but if you then want to learn about C# events in more detail, definitely go watch the dedicated video. And I also made a page on my website for this course. It contains a link to download all of the project assets. You can also download the complete project files for every single lecture. So if you get stuck at any point, you can download the code at that lecture and compare with your own. There's also references to all of the videos, and I will also be including frequently asked questions for each lecture. So definitely keep that page open in a second tab as you follow along this course. Now, this free course took a ton of work to make, so I really hope you find this video helpful. Go ahead and hit the like button if it helps you. It's a small thing, but it generally does help this video on the YouTube algorithm. Making this course was a ton of work, and by making it completely free, it means it will obviously never make as much money as if I had just made this a paid course. I'm perfectly okay with that decision, with the hopes that by making it free, it will reach and help many more people. I'm also a big believer that education should be free, so if you can't afford one of my paid courses, like if you're just a kid or going through a rough time, I still want you to have access to high quality education so you can achieve your game dev dreams. One easy way you can help me for free is simply by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and just watching this course. That will hopefully help push this video on the YouTube algorithm and help it reach many more people. Another free way to support what I do is I'm currently working on my next Steam game called Total World Liberation. You can wishlist the game on Steam. Wishlists matter a lot for Steam visibility, so just by doing that you will be helping me. And just in case you can't afford it, and you find this free course useful, you can also support what I do in a few other ways. I spent a bunch of money making this course. I hired an artist for the 3D assets so that I had the rights to distribute them so that you can download and follow along. Same thing for the music and sound effects, the logo, and the cost to upload the game to Steam. So I would like to at least not lose money on this project. Hopefully there's enough of you who can afford to help me so that I can at least break even. And for one way you can support is I added this exact same course on my website as a regular paid course. Although I want to be very clear, there is absolutely no difference between this free video and the paid course. There is absolutely nothing behind any kind of paywall. All of the lectures are free, all of the asks are free, everything is free. You don't have to pay for anything if you can't afford it or you just don't want to. The paid version is essentially a donation. The only difference is this free YouTube video has regular YouTube ads, whereas the paid version on the website doesn't have any ads. That's it, that's the only thing. So the only reason why I made that paid version is just in case some of you can't afford it and you want to support what I do and want to help me break even on this project. But again, only do that if you can afford it. If you can't, that's perfectly fine. I hope you'll learn a ton from watching and following this free course. Beyond that, if you follow this course and you enjoy my teaching style, perhaps look into my other courses. If you like this video, then I think you will really like my turn-based strategy course. That is the perfect course to follow up on this one. It dives even deeper into some of the concepts used here, and it will help you make the jump from beginner to advanced. And since you're interested in Unity, I think my Ultimate Unity Overview course would also be very useful to you. Each lecture on that course is focused on teaching one Unity tool or feature. There's already over 50 lectures, including plenty of small but very important things that you just wouldn't see in a regular YouTube video. If you're interested in visual scripting, I have a course on making 3 unique games entirely with visual scripting and no code at all. Or if you prefer code, you can learn how to build a nice Builder Defender game. So if you enjoy my teaching style in this free course, then check out my other ones. Then of course YouTube has channel memberships and super thanks, so you can use those if you want. I also have my Patreon if you prefer that. And in a lot of my videos I have some affiliate links. If you ever pick up anything through those, I get a nice commission. And I also have some of my own assets on the Unity App Store. So if you enjoy this free course and you want to support what I do, there's plenty of ways. But again, don't feel obligated. If you can't afford it or you just don't want to, that's perfectly fine. I hope you'll learn a ton from watching and following this free course. Alright, so that's enough talk of that for now. Before we begin building the game from scratch, let's inspect the final polished game that we're going to build. So let's see that in the next lecture. Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. Here let's take a look at the final game that we're going to build. So we start off on a simple but really nice main menu. So we've got a nice visual, a nice logo, and a bunch of useful buttons. Then of course the game has a nice loading system, so when I click on play, it's going to load into a loading scene and then finally into the final game scene. So let's go ahead and play. And if there we go, here we do see the game scene, and right away we see a nice tutorial window. So it's telling us how to play the game, so the basic interactions, and then over here the controls. Importantly, these are all rebindable, so over here this element is all dynamic. Then we can look at this tutorial for as long as we want, and we are waiting for the interact to continue. There's also a really nice song playing in the background, so the game has music. Now we can look at this tutorial for as long as we want, and when we're ready we can interact to continue. And as soon as we do, yep, there you go, we've got a nice countdown, some nice animations, a nice sound effect, and there you go, now we are playing. Okay, so here I am controlling a nice character. I can move in any direction. There is collision detection, so obviously I cannot go inside solid objects. So I can walk around, and for the goal of the game, over here on the left side we've got recipes that the customers are waiting for. So for example, one customer wants a simple burger. So for that, we gotta need to pick up a nice bun, so let's pick it up. Then the burger obviously requires a meat patty, so let's go ahead, we can pick one up from here, but this one is an uncooked meat patty, so we need to drop it over here on the stove. And there you go, it starts cooking. We've got a nice timer, we've got a nice world bar UI. And there you go, it keeps counting, and we've got some nice particles, some nice visuals, and over there even a nice indicator telling us the meat is about to burn. And there you go, the meat has burned. So now I can pick this up, and I'm holding some burnt meat, so the customer probably doesn't want to eat this. So we can go over here to the trash in order to trash it. Let's try doing another one and do it properly. So let's wait for it to cook. Pick up a plate so we can pick it up directly onto the plate. There you go, the meat is cooked, so let's pick it up. Then go pick up some bread, and there you go, here we have our complete recipe. So let's go into the delivery counter, deliver it, and there you go, a nice delivery success. Alright, awesome, we've just delivered our first recipe. So then someone else wants a salad, so let's go ahead and pick up a tomato. Here we have a big uncut tomato, so let's drop it onto a cutting board. And now we can interact with it, so we can interact with a secondary interaction key. And by interacting, we cut the tomato, so it takes a few cuts, and there you go, it slices, and it's sliced into tomato slices. So let's do the same thing for the cabbage. here we are holding a regular cabbage, then slice it, and this one actually takes a bunch more, and there you go, got both slices. Okay, great. So now let's pick up the plate, pick up both slices, and deliver to the customer, and there you go, got a nice success. Alright, awesome. And of course, we have a correct identification of if we have a correct recipe or not. So if I just pick up an empty plate and deliver it, there you go, we got a failed delivery because nobody wants just an empty plate. Alright, so here you can already see quite a lot of interactions, quite a lot of systems at work. So the character has a nice character controller, it has physics interaction, you can see how it identifies the counter that is in front of the character. I can press a button to interact with the counter, and interacting with different counters does different things. So if I interact with a clear counter, I can pick up or drop things. Over here I can pick up and drop it. With an alternate interaction, I can do the second action. Then there's the stove machine, so that one has a nice state machine, so it counts up. Over here we've got some nice particles, we've got a nice bloom, so all the visuals look really great, so we've got some post-processing. We have a bunch of UI elements directly on the world, and outside of here we've got some regular UI elements. So we've got the recipes with dynamic icons for all of them. We've got a timer over there on the top right corner showing how long we have to deliver all our recipes. And on the kitchen counter we're also using a custom shader, so this was built using shader graph. So as you can see, lots of interlocked systems. Then the game also has, of course, the basics that any game should have. So I can pause the game, and there you go, we've got a nice pause menu. So we can resume to go back, or pause it again. And of course, while paused, everything is paused, so that's great. We can go back into the main menu, or we can go into options. And over here we can play around the sound effects volume, the music volume. We've got all of our controls. Importantly, these are the controls for the keyboard and also the gamepad. So the game can be played with any gamepad, so it can be an Xbox controller, PlayStation, Switch controller, it doesn't matter, all of them work. And we can also rebind all of these keys, both the keys as well as the gamepad inputs. So let's go ahead and deliver a cheeseburger, so here's some burnt meat, so let's toss this. Then pick up some more meat, pick up a plate, here we've got some cheese, we've got some bread, pick up the meat and deliver it. Alright, awesome! And of course, finally at the end, when our timer is elapsed, here we have a nice game over window showing how many recipes we delivered. Alright, so this is the final game that we're going to build. As you can see, it involves lots of interesting interactions which require learning lots of different skills. We're going to be using C# interfaces, C# events, the new input system, shader graphs, scriptable objects. We're going to learn about C# events, make a character controller, handle collisions, and so on. Like I said, one thing that we're going to focus heavily throughout the making of this game is on writing good, clean code. Meaning that the final game that we're going to build will be very easy to expand upon. Thanks to how all the code is very clean, it will be very easy to add more recipes, maybe more counters with more actions, maybe things like perhaps washing dishes, adding an oven and so on. Or really, you could make something completely different. This game is all about character and interactions, so that could be whatever you want. You could take this as a base and build some kind of sci-fi game, something like Among Us or FTL. You could make a survival crafting game like Rust or Minecraft or Don't Starve. Really, by learning how to build this game, by the end you will have gained the knowledge required to build all kinds of unique and interesting games. Alright, so now that we've seen the final game, let's actually build it. Just before we do, let's get a quick refresher of the absolute basics you should know in the next lecture. Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture we're going to just get a quick refresher of the absolute basics you should know in order to be able to follow everything in this course. Okay, so like I said, this free course is targeted at both beginners and more intermediate users. In order to start following the course, you really only need to know the absolute basics. I've made 3 useful videos with all of the basic knowledge required to follow this course. Watch the video on how to download, install, and set up Unity, then the quick Unity basics, and the C# basics. Those 3 quick videos contain all of the absolute basic knowledge you need. So if you're a complete beginner, go ahead, pause this video, and go quickly watch those. And even if you're already somewhat familiar with Unity, still go ahead and give those videos a watch, perhaps in a faster speed, just so you know everything that this course assumes that you know. Here I will assume that you know the basics covered in those videos, like what is a game object, what is a transform, what is a mono behavior, how scripts have a start and update, and some C# basics. As long as you know those absolute basics, you should be able to follow everything in this course. I will teach everything above the absolute basics. And if you are a more advanced user, definitely keep watching. The beginning of this course might not have much that is new to you, but as we build the game and start using more advanced tools like scriptable objects, C# events, and interfaces, refactoring code and focusing on project architecture and writing some good clean code, if you are not a complete beginner, you will still learn quite a lot from seeing how this project is built. And again, like I said, I answer comments every single day, so any questions you have, just post them there and I'll do my best to help. This course is split into lectures. They are all as chapters on the video so you can navigate around. Let me also take this time to point out that you are not expected to follow this course in one sitting. Go ahead and take your time, focus on actually learning. Remember, that's the only goal. You're not competing with anyone, you're gaining knowledge just for yourself. So take as much time as you need, rewatch some lectures if you feel you didn't fully get it, or just ask some questions. Whatever you do, take your time and just focus on actually learning. So again, if you haven't done so, go ahead, pause this video and go watch those 3 basics videos. With that, we're going to have everything we need to get started. We're going to start completely from scratch, so let's begin creating a brand new project in the next lecture. Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture, we're going to begin actually building our game. So let's create a completely empty project and start building it all from scratch. Okay, so the first thing that we need is to install Unity. Now I covered this in detail in that other basics video, so here I will assume that you already have Unity Hub installed. The first decision we really need to make is choosing a Unity version. So on Unity Hub, you go into Installs and install an editor. And now Unity recommends that you use the LTS version or long-term support. You should be using that one in most cases. It's what it installs by default, which as of the time of this recording, the latest LTS one is 2021.3. However, I want this video to stay up to date for as long as possible, so for making this game, I will actually be using version 2022.2. If you're watching this video right as it came out, then download this version. And if you're watching this months in the future, after version 22 LTS is out, then you can use that one. It won't probably be the exact same thing as version 22.2, so you should be able to follow everything exactly. For any changes, I will point them out in the updated pinned comment. And if you're watching this years in the future and there's an even newer LTS version, I would still recommend you follow using the 22 LTS. Don't worry about using a quote-unquote older version. Everything you'll learn here in this version will still be applicable even 10 years from now. So like I said, I'm going to be installing this one. And in terms of modules, it doesn't really need anything. I already have Visual Studio Community installed, and all of the other ones are unticked, so install. Okay, so the version is installed. Now let's create a new project. Let's go into the Projects tab. Then create a new project. And now first up here, make sure to select the right version. So again, I'm going to be using 22.2. Then for the templates, this has mainly to do with the Unity render pipelines. Now, if you're a beginner, don't worry about that too much. Just go ahead and select the 3D URP template. So scroll down, this one right here, 3D URP. Make sure to select this one and not the one that says just 3D. The URP here stands for the Universal Render Pipeline, which means our game will be playable on literally any platform. So we can make the final game and put it on Steam or consoles or mobile. It will run on everything. Then over here on the right side, let's quickly just download the template. There it is, it's done. Now select the name for your project. So I'm going to call this Kitchen Chaos and then select the folder for it. Alright, so that's it. Again, make sure you're using the exact right version. Make sure you're using the 3D URP template. Give it a name, a folder, and let's hit on create. Alright, so it's open, and right away you might or might not see a window talking about URP material upgrades. I think this has to do with the template not having the default materials updated to the latest URP version. So if you're watching this in the future, chances are you might not see this one at all. But if you do, then just go ahead, click on OK, and it will automatically upgrade all of the default materials. Alright, so here we have our basic Unity window. Now, since we started a project starting from the URP template, we have down here a bunch of URP helper files. So you can click to select the README file, and you can see it over here on the right side on the inspector. If you want, you can browse around these links in order to learn more about URP, but in our case, for building our game, we really don't need this. So over here on the inspector, let's just click this button to clean up these README files. Just go ahead, click on yes, and okay, that's it. So basically you should only have these files in your project window. So there's the scene folder, and inside we've got the sample scene, then we've got the settings, and inside a bunch of URP assets. All this should have been set up automatically since we use the 3D template. And then finally we just have the URP global settings asset. Now let's just verify everything worked correctly. So let's go to the top left, go into edit, then go down into project settings. Then over here, let's go into the graphics tab, and you should see the URP high fidelity asset assigned by default. If not, you can click on the circle icon and assign it. Then the other menus over here, the URP global settings. Again, this one should be set by default. Then down here on the quality tab, on this one, make sure high fidelity is selected. Basically, whatever you select here is the quality that we'll be using in the editor. And in turn, the selected quality over here also has a render pipeline asset. Now, in order to avoid any confusion, let's actually get rid of the other ones. So let's just click on the trash icon to get rid of the performance and the balance quality. So just click and click. Okay, so we only have this one. Then let's close the project settings and let's go into the settings folder. And over here, let's select the URP balance. There are 2 assets for each quality, so select those, leave the high fidelity and the performance, and let's delete these. Alright, that's it. By the way, if you made a mistake and accidentally deleted something, don't worry. You can always just click over here on the plus icon on the project window, and then go over here under rendering, and you can create a new URP asset with universal render. Okay, so just like this. So we only have one quality setting, we have high fidelity. The quality setting is using this render pipeline asset, which is also using this renderer. So that's really it. With this, we have the absolute bare minimum we need. If in the end, after building the whole game, you want to provide multiple quality settings, then you can come back to this menu and recreate them. But in order to avoid confusion while building the game, let's keep things like this as simple as possible. Okay, so that's the basic setup done. Next, we want to prepare our layout, so let's continue on to the next lecture. Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture, we're going to learn about the Unity layout and set it up. So first things first, let's familiarize ourselves with the various Unity windows to create our own layout. It's very important that you feel comfortable with your layout, that you have easy access to all the things that you need and you know where everything is. You can see that there's lots of tabs everywhere over here on the Unity window. All of them can be dragged and dropped in any different position. So you can customize your layout to get it looking exactly as you want. You can set it up in any way, but it will be easier to follow this course if you're following the same layout as me. I'm assuming you've seen my quick basics video, so I'm assuming you know what is the inspector, what is a game object, what is a transform, what is the console, what is the hierarchy, and so on. If this is the very first time you're seeing the Unity interface, go watch that other quick video first just to learn the absolute basics. Now for me, I've been using Unity for over 10 years now, so let's see the layout that I've developed over the years. First, the inspector on the right side, just like default. That way we always have a nice view of the selected object and whatever scripts and components it has. Then for the hierarchy, I like to put it down here on the left side. We're going to make sure that our scene is always organized, so we don't need the hierarchy to take up tons of space. Then with the project files next to it, this corner is enough to really browse all of the files. We want the console to be on the tab right next to it. Usually I find that when making the game, I want to look at the project window, but when playing the game, I just want to look at the console. So keeping them in the same place but on different tabs works great. Then over here on the center, the scene view, and again with the game view right next to it. Okay, so this is the basic layout that I normally use. Now for a couple more options, let's go into the project window. And on the top right corner, you can see over here these little 3 dots. By default, it shows you a 2-column layout, so there's a column here and a column here. But personally, I prefer the 1-column layout. This showcases all of the project files in a nice compact list view. The one thing where I prefer the other one is if you're browsing for some visual assets over here, you can increase the thumbnail size. But for most times, I really like to use the 1-column layout, much more compact. Also, since we're talking about the project window, just in case you don't know, there's over here this little button with the eye. This one has to do with package visibility. If you toggle it, then some of the installed packages are hidden, whereas if you untoggle it, then you can see all of the various packages with all the source code and so on. You can expand over here the packages, and right now it is showing all of them with source code, the things, everything there. And if you click on this, then it hides and only shows a bunch of core ones. But for the most part, you really want to leave this ticked and leave this one collapsed, nice and clean. Okay, so then on the console, over here, once again, let's go into the 3 dots. And for the log entry, for this one, I like to select 1 line. This makes the console nice and compact, which I personally prefer. You can see more logs without taking up more space. And if you want to read the whole log, you can always just click on it to see the whole stack trace. Now, there are also some more options over here if you want. For example, show the timestamp. This will show the timestamp when each message was sent. You can use a monospace font, meaning a font where every character has the exact same width. So a bunch of options, but for me, leaving it just like this works perfectly fine. Then also importantly, over here, these 3 buttons. These toggle the visibility for the type of messages that appear in the console. The left one, this one is for regular messages. We're going to use this a lot. Then we've got warnings and finally errors. If you untoggle them, then the messages of that type will not show up on the console. So if you ever come across an issue where nothing is showing up on the console, make sure all 3 of these buttons are ticked. Then on the left side, on clear, you can click on the arrow to see more options. I like to set it to clear on play. Then collapse. This one basically collapses messages that are the same, all of them into one entry. Personally, I do not like this. I want to see every single message as it comes out, even if it's repeated. I've also seen this lead to a lot of confusion for some people. They think their code is firing just one message when it's actually firing hundreds. So to avoid any confusion, make sure you leave this untoggled. Then for error pause, this will automatically pause the game when an error occurs. You should definitely have this one toggled. If there's an error, you definitely want to know about it. You want to know when it happens so you can fix it. Whereas if you untoggle this, you might get some errors and the game might keep playing, which will then lead to lots of confusion when something starts behaving weirdly. So always leave this one toggled. And then the editor button, this one is for a more advanced use case, so don't worry about it. Okay, so that's the console. Then over here for the game view, we've got a button here to select the aspect ratio. Let's go ahead and select Full HD. This one is a 16:9 aspect ratio, so everything is pretty normal. This will really only matter when we start working on the UI, but still I like to keep it as 16:9 always. Then on this button that says Play Focus, we can modify some options. Basically, Focus will play exactly like this on this small window. If you choose Maximize, then it will maximize this window when playing the game, and Play in Focus will play the game even when the window is not in focus. Then another important one is actually on the same one as the aspect ratio. Here we've got a button to toggle VSync. Usually when developing the game, you really want to toggle this. That's because right in the beginning, when the game doesn't really have anything, if you leave it untoggled, then this might run at like 1000 frames per second, and that will pretty much drive your GPU crazy. Finally, if your game view is looking a bit too pixelated, make sure over here on the scale slider, make sure this one is not zoomed in. This one should always be pushed straight to the left as much as possible. Okay, so that's the game view. Then over here on the scene view, for this one default should be good. These two buttons are extremely important. Pretty much all the time you want to keep the tool handles on the pivot and not on the center. If you ever see your handles on weird places, always come back to this. You want this on pivot pretty much all the time. Then for rotation, sometimes local is useful, but for the most part you should probably be keeping it in global. Then for the grid, showing the grid and Y, yep, that looks pretty good. A nice little visual grid. Then you've got a bunch more options if you want. Then next to it we've got snapping. This one we also don't need this for now. And finally, same thing for increment, also don't need this. Okay, then on the right for the draw mode, let's leave it unshaded. For 2D, let's leave this disabled since we're working on a 3D game. For lights, let's make sure this one is enabled. For sound, we're only going to add this in the end, so it doesn't really matter for now. Then for special effects, usually you want this one to be enabled so it shows everything. You can click on the arrow and make sure all of them are toggled. The only exception is always refresh. You probably don't need this little scene window to be refreshing at 60 frames per second, so you can leave that one unticked and tick all the others. Then these are for the hidden objects, so let's leave them toggled. For the camera, here are the defaults. And finally, gizmos, leave them all enabled as the defaults. Alright, so with all that said, here is the layout that I'm going to be using throughout the course. It will be easier to follow the course if you're using the exact same layout as me, so ideally you should be using this. But again, like I mentioned, all the windows are customizable, so if there's something that you absolutely prefer differently, then go ahead. You can drag and drop and place any windows anywhere you want. So once you have a layout you're happy with, you can go up here to the top right corner where it says default, you can click on it, and here you've got a bunch of layouts, so you can save your new layout. So I'm going to save this one as Kitchen Chaos, and then over here you can select any one you want. For example, if you ever have some issues with any kind of weird editor windows, you can load back the default layout and then go back and load your own layout. Okay, so with that, our layout is set up. The next important thing is setting up Visual Studio, so let's do that in the next lecture. Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture, we're going to set up our Visual Studio. Alright, so with the Unity layout set up, let's make sure Visual Studio is also set up correctly. I'm going to be using version 22 Community. This one is the free version. You don't absolutely have to use the same code ID that I'm using. You can use Rider or VS Code or whatever you want. So let's see my setup for Visual Studio. But first, let's actually set up something over here in Unity. So let's go up top into Window, and then let's open up the Package Manager. Then over here on the drop-down menu, let's select the packages and select the ones from the Unity registry. Then let's scroll down to find the Visual Studio Editor package. So here it is, this one. This package basically handles the integration with Visual Studio, so you can use the debugger and a bunch of things. Alternatively, there's also a package over here for Visual Studio Code, and there's also one over here for JetBrains Rider. So if you're using a different IDE, go ahead and install the package. For me, I'm going to install the Visual Studio one, so this one. Just go ahead and install. Okay, it's done. So next, let's go up into Edit and let's open up the Preferences. Then over here, let's go down into External Tools. And on the External Script Editor, make sure you select the one you're using. So again, for me, I'm using Visual Studio 22. And also over here, you've got a bunch of extra options. Now, if you want to play around with reading the source code for the various Unity packages, then you can tick all these boxes. But in our case, for this simple game, we don't need that. So go ahead and leave everything just like this with defaults. Okay, so with this set up, now we can go over here into Assets and open up the C# project. And this should open up Visual Studio. And alright, so here it is. Now for some more settings inside of here. In my Visual Studio, I have a really nice extension that adds a bit more colors to my code, which makes it easier to read and write. So up top, let's go into the Extensions menu and Manage Extensions. And the important one that I've installed is this one, Viasfora. If you want, you can go into the Online tab and over here search for it. And yep, it does show up in here. Then for the settings on that extension, let's go up here into Tools and let's open up the Options. Then over here, let's scroll down and find Viasfora. Yep, this one. And here are all the settings, and expand this and a bunch more settings. Now for me, I think these are only defaults. I don't remember if I changed anything. The important one is over here, the rainbow braces. So these have a bunch of colors which make it a bit easier to read the code. So let's create a simple script just to see this. So back in Unity, let's go into the project window, let's click the plus icon, and let's create a brand new C# script. Let's call it just testing, wait for it to compile, And now let's open. Now over here, I'm just going to write a bunch of simple code just to test it out. You don't have to follow this. Alright, so here's a bunch of sample code. These are the colors. You can see it makes everything a bit easier to read. Although again, this is not a requirement. You don't absolutely need this extension, but personally I do find it quite useful. I find that it helps make the code more readable than having everything be gray. Okay, so that's the setup for this extension. Next, for the text formatting options. So once again, let's go into Tools, go into Options, and then over here, let's go into the text editor. Then over here, I think I've got pretty much all the same defaults. Then we can go into the C# rules. So here are all the settings. If you notice something different on your end, go ahead and pause the video and compare the settings. But again, I think everything here is pretty much defaults. I believe the only difference that I did was over here on the code style. Over here for the new lines. Personally, I like to have the curly brackets on the same line, but if you want, you can also change it and put it on the second line. I think that's pretty much the only difference that I did. Everything else should be exactly the same as defaults. So that's the code style settings. And speaking of that, the next lecture is very important. We're going to talk a bit about naming rules. Although, just before we go, let's just clean up our testing script. So let's close this one, click on the X, then back into Unity. We don't need the script, so let's just delete it. Okay, so with that, we have Visual Studio set up and ready to go. Now let's continue in the next lecture to learn about some naming rules. Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture we're going to learn something extremely important. Let's learn about naming rules. This one is a very important lecture that you should definitely refer back to whenever you have some questions. So first, what exactly are naming rules? These are really just rules you follow when writing your code. It is extremely important that you are consistent in applying your own rules. You don't want one class in your game to be written a certain way and then a different class using a completely different style. That would create tons of confusion. So naming rules and writing the code correctly is very, very important. One mistake that I see a lot of beginners do is they send me some code and ask why it's not working. Then I take a quick look and I see that all of the code is written in a very messy way. Some functions are in lowercase, others using snake case, some fields are in Pascal case, some in camel case, and so on. Remember that code is case sensitive, so it is extremely important that you write the code correctly. If you change a character from lowercase to uppercase, then you are suddenly referring to something completely different. If you're a beginner, keep that always in your mind. Code is case sensitive, so don't just write code semi-randomly. Write it properly as if you were doing an English literature test. Now with that said, when it comes to naming rules, you can use whatever naming rules you want. Different people like different rules. For example, you can use a prefix in your variables, you can use a postfix, you can use capitals for constants, camel case for properties, snake case for fields. By the way, here are the definitions of what those terms actually mean. Pascal case starts with a capital and every word is capitalized. Camel case starts lowercase and then uppercase for the first letter of every other word, kind of like a camel hump in the middle. And snake case is where you add an underscore in between the words. Like I said, every rule can be valid. The important thing is that you are consistent in always following through with your rules. As you might know, Unity mono behaviors have some default functions you can implement, things like start and update, which are written using Pascal case. Since you can't really change Unity's rules, at least on function names, I would say you should base your rules off of theirs. So for functions, you should probably be using Pascal case. For the other rules, like I said, choose whatever makes sense to you. Here are some of my own personal rules that I've developed over the last 10 years and the code style that I will be following in this course. For functions, I use Pascal case, just like Unity and just like the C# standard. For function parameters, I use camel case. For fields, also camel case. Properties are in Pascal case. Constants are in uppercase snake case. Then another rule is that I like to add the type of the variable as a postfix. So if it's a list, I append the list. If it's an array, I append the array. And now you might be thinking, with this, wouldn't it be an issue if you change the type, then the name is suddenly wrong? And the simple solution for that is that if I change the type, then I just use Visual Studio to quickly change the name. That's it. Then for the curly brackets, like I mentioned in the previous lecture, I like them on the same line. Some people have some very strong opinions about this. Really, it's just a visual style, and this is the one that I personally prefer. If you like Newline, then go ahead and use that. It doesn't change how the code works in any way. And a final rule, spend some time deciding on a proper name and don't be afraid to rename things. You will note how all the code that we're going to write in this course has proper names for everything. You should never use a variable with a single letter like X or K. The exception, of course, would be iterators in a for loop. Also, don't use acronyms or abbreviations. Those might seem clear right now, but in a few weeks you might not remember what they mean. Remember, you don't get bonus points for writing extremely compact code, so prioritize making your code readable and understandable, even if it requires variables and functions with long names. So these are my general rules and the code style that I personally follow. Figure out what works for you and follow your own naming rules. But naturally, in this course I won't be using my own code style, so if when following the course you're not sure how to write some type of code, you can refer back to this lecture and watch it again. Like I've mentioned many times, the code that I will teach you how to write in this course is on the exact same level of quality as my paid courses and my Steam games. So as such, because of that, this lecture, these naming rules are all extremely important. Okay, so with this very important lecture out of the way, now let's start playing with some visuals by importing some assets in the next lecture. Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture, we're going to import the project files with all the assets that we're going to use. By the way, remember that if you have any questions, go ahead and post them in the comments. I go through those every day and I'll do my best to help. Okay, so with the project created, the next thing we want is to import the assets that we're going to use to make this game. You can download all of the assets with a link in the description, which by the way, like I mentioned a while ago, that link contains a Unity package that contains both the assets and the final game. So when you download that, you get a Unity package. Just go ahead and double click or click and drag and drop it on the projects window. Here is the asset import window, just make sure you select all and let's import. Okay, so here it is, this imported the assets folder and inside comes all of the assets, meshes, textures and so on. So everything we're going to need. And then it also imported inside of it another Unity package. So if you want to import the final project with all of the code already written, it's also here. If you extract this one, you're going to get the complete project files. Now of course, don't do that if you want to follow along with the course. And be aware that if you're following along and you accidentally unpack this one, it will overwrite all of your own files. So if you want to inspect the final project files, go ahead and do that, but do that in a separate project. In order to make sure that we have no accidents, I'm going to delete this one from the current project. So just go ahead and delete. Okay, so that's it. And over here we've got all of our really nice visuals. We can look in the prefabs visuals, and over here we've got a visual for a container. So there we go, that's a container counter. Then we have a cutting counter. We've got a trash bin. Then on the kitchen object visuals, we've got all the visuals, so a block of cheese, we've got some burned meat, we've got a plate, and so on. These are all the nice 3D models that we're going to use in our game. And then over here on the textures folder, we also got a bunch of general icons, as well as actual icons for all of the various parts. Okay, so all of the assets have been imported. Now let's continue on to the next lecture. Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture, we're going to set up post-processing. Now here, let me make a quick note. Usually when making your games, you probably don't want to handle post-processing right away. You should first get an ugly prototype up and working before worrying about any visuals. So normally I would only add post-processing much later on in the dev process, but since this is a course in video format, in order for the video to look a bit more appealing, let's set up post-processing right away. Now we already have the project set up to use URP, so adding post-processing is actually super simple. It's actually already added by default. First, before we do that, let's rename our scene with a proper name. So inside the scenes folder, it starts off with sample scene. This will be our main game scene, so let's just rename this to game scene. Okay, and now here on the hierarchy, we can see by default, this scene already contains a global volume game object. This is how you actually add post-processing. And by default, you can see that it also already has a sample profile attached. This is how you add all of the various effects. You can click on this link and it will show it over here on the project window. Now let's build this from scratch instead of starting from this one. So let's go into that file, into that asset, and just delete it. Okay, so now we have no volume profile. Now let's go ahead and click on new to create a brand new one. Okay, so now here we can add overrides, add all of the effects that we want. Let's drag some visual meshes that we imported in the last lecture to get a better look at all of these effects and what they do. So first let's make some kind of floor. So let's make a 3D object. Let's make it a plane. Let's name this the floor. Also, one extremely important thing, whenever you create a brand new object, always check the object's transform position. By default, when you create an object, it appears in front of the scene camera, which will probably not be on 000. You always want to be very careful with the position of your actual objects. So for a plane, we do want this to be on the origin, so on 000. So make sure you always do that. Then let's scale it up a bit. So on the scale, let's put it on 555. Which, by the way, you've got this nice little icon. This was added in a recent Unity version. Basically, if you enable this, then it matches all of these values. So if you just change one of them, it changes all of them. So let's put this on 5. Okay, great. Now for the visual, let's go ahead into the mesh render on the materials, and let's select a brand new material. So let's click on the circle icon. And over here, let's find the floor material. So here it is. It's the one included in the assets. So there we go, we've got a nice basic floor material. Now let's also drag the player visual, so let's go inside the assets folder, and over here let's go inside the prefabs visuals, and down here we find the player visual, so let's just go ahead and drag this one. So there it is, a nice player visual. Let's also drag a counter, so let's find, let's say the clear counter. Let's drag this one. Let's rotate it to face the camera, something like this. And let's also put a cutting counter. Again, we're just placing some visuals just so we can see what the post-processing will do. And let's also place a bunch more things. So let's say a tomato. Let's place a tomato over there. And maybe a cabbage all the way over here. Okay, so we've got a handful of nice visual elements so we can test out our post-processing. By the way, here's a quick Unity tip on scene controls. Whenever you are on the scene view, which make sure you're on scene view and not game view, those are different. So on the scene view, you can move the camera with the mouse. You can pan with mouse 3, so the middle mouse button. So hold that and pan it around. You can rotate with the right mouse button. You can rotate around the point by holding down left alt and left click and just drag it around. To rotate around an object, you can select an object, like for example player visual. Then you can press on F to select that object. And now if you hold alt and click, it will rotate around that object. Also another method is you can hold the right mouse button to move it around, and then you can use WAS to move, so D, A, and so on. Then you can even press Shift to move in faster. And you can use the scroll wheel whilst holding down the right mouse button in order to modify the speed at which you move. So there are plenty of camera controls to really get you seeing exactly what you want to see. Now for another quick Unity tip, you can move the scene camera to where you want the game camera to be. So let's say I want the game camera to see things from about this angle. So you just position the scene camera. Then on the hierarchy, select the camera game object, so the main camera right here. And with that object selected, you press Ctrl, Shift, and F. And if there you go, you can see over here on the camera preview that it positioned the main camera looking on the exact same position at the exact same direction as the scene camera. So that's the shortcut Ctrl, Shift, F, or alternatively go up into game object and over here align with view. Now if you look, here is the scene view, and over here we've got the nice camera view. So just position the camera somewhere where we can view all of the assets. Now with this, let's add some post-processing effects. So first, let's select the global volume game object, and over here we can add all of our effect overrides. First up, let's begin by adding tone mapping. So there you go, we've got the effect, and over here we've got a nice little checkbox, so you can enable it in order to enable this effect and set one of the options. Now for this one, I'm not too familiar with color correction, but I find that usually adding a neutral tone map, usually that helps. Also make sure you're looking at the game view and not the scene view. If you're looking at the game view and you enable and disable this effect, you should see a difference. Whereas on the scene view, if you enable and disable, it doesn't actually show that. Even if on the scene view over here you have all the effects enabled, even with that, some effects for some reason don't show up on the scene view. So when playing around these effects, always make sure you're looking through the game view. So like I said, you should be able to toggle this and see a visual difference on the game view. If you don't, then make sure the camera has post-processing enabled. So let's select the main camera game object, and down here there's a toggle for post-processing. Make sure this one is enabled. And then also on the render pipeline asset, so let's find that one on the project window. Over here we've got the settings and you've got the URP high fidelity. This one should be using a renderer, so if you click on the renderer, over here you should have post-processing enabled. Again, all of this should already be correctly set up by default. So if you go into global volume and enable or disable, you should see a visual difference. Okay, so next effect. One that I always like to add is a bit of saturation. So let's add an override, post-processing, and let's add a brand new, here it is, color adjustments. Then over here, you've got plenty of things to play around with. For me, I like to add a bit of saturation, so just lift it up a little bit. Let's say just about 20. And I also like to add a little bit of contrast. So over here, let's also add 20. And there you go, it makes the colors pop a little bit more. So personally, I like this effect. Then later on, we're going to have some glowing objects, for example, the stove. Let's actually try dragging that into the scene. So let's go into scene view, and in the assets, let's find the stove counter. So here it is. And inside the stove counter, there are some things. So here it is, the stove on visual. This one is disabled by default. So on the inspector, let's just enable this game object to make it visible. Again, don't worry about the positioning of the objects on the scene view right now. We're only positioning them just to set up the post-processing. We're going to delete them all at the end of this lecture. Okay, so that one enabled. Let's go into the game view, and over here we see the stove enabled. So now let's go into the global volume. Let's add an override, go into post-processing, let's add a bloom effect. So right now, notice how that one is not glowing red hot. For that to work, we need to have bloom, and we need to enable the threshold and the intensity. If we raise the intensity, we do see, yep, there we go, a really nice glow there. By the way, here's a quick visual tip. If you want to make your game feel a bit more ethereal and magical, one good way is to put the threshold at a low value, below 1, so something like 0.5, and then put the intensity as a little bit. And with this, notice how everything has a slight glow, even colors that don't have any extra intensity. So the floor is glowing, the character is glowing, so everything looks quite a bit ethereal. This is a bit extreme, but it is an interesting effect. Also, another quick note here, in case you're not seeing anything change, make sure you go into the render pipeline assets, so the URP high fidelity, and over here make sure AGR is enabled. You can look at the stove glow. If I disable it, yep, that one stops glowing, and with that enabled, it does start glowing. AGR stands for high dynamic range, so that is how you can have a color go with an intensity above 1, which actually makes it glow when you have the bloom post-processing. If even with that you're still seeing issues, then make sure you go into the renderer, and over here for the post-processing, sometimes Unity has a weird bug and doesn't generate this post-process data file. So if that does happen, just go ahead, untoggle and toggle this, and it should work. And finally, like I said, on the camera, make sure you have post-processing enabled. So with all of that, you should be able to see the game view glow. Okay, back into our effects. With our bloom working, like I said, you can lower this below 1 to get a nice ethereal look, but this is a bit too intense on what we want, so let's make it a bit more subtle. So on the threshold, let's put it at 0.95. So there's a slight glow on the white parts, but nothing too intense. And for the intensity, let's put it at a regular 1. Okay, so I think that's a nice amount of bloom. All the colors glow a little bit, and we can see over there the stove, it is indeed glowing. Okay, great. Now, if you ever forget all of these steps and you can't get your project to glow, I made a nice video with a nice checklist of everything needed for you to glow. Definitely go ahead and watch that video whenever you have issues. Then for another fun effect, we have vignette. So let's go into add override, post-processing, and let's find the vignette. What this one does is adds a bit of darkness to the colors. So if we enable the intensity and we increase it, you can see what it does. So it adds darkness right on the corners there. Personally, I find this one looks good when it's quite a bit subtle. So let's put the intensity at something like 0.25. And then for the smoothness, let's also put it on 0.4. So just like that, just a slight darkness on the edges. So personally, I think it looks pretty good. And that's pretty much it for the post-processing on the volume component. I like how this looks. You can see the difference with the volume enabled or disabled. Quite a big difference. Looks pretty nice. But again, these are just visuals, so feel free to play around, maybe add some more effects, use some different settings. These are just visuals. They don't impact the game logic at all, so feel free to make it work exactly as you want it. Then yet another thing related to post-processing but not in this component is some anti-aliasing. For that, one place where you can change it is on the main camera. Over here you see a field for post-processing and you have a bunch of types. So FXAA or SMAA. Or if you want some more higher end post-processing, you can go into the render pipeline assets, so URP high fidelity, and over here we see anti-aliasing MSAA. This one is a bit more expensive, but looks a bit better. If you want to see the difference, you can go over here into the game view, and on the slider up top on the scale, you can increase this quite a bit. So with this, we can now see the pixelation, and you can see over here if I switch anti-aliasing from 4x back into disable, you can see lots of jagged edges. And if I put it on 2x, yep, looks a bit more smooth, 4x a bit more smooth, and 8x even more smooth. So with that, you can see the difference on all the edges, all the things. By default, this renderer has on 4x and nothing on the camera. This already looks pretty good, but to make the video look even better, I'm going to put it on 8x. And on the main camera, I'm also going to leave it with no anti-aliasing. You can combine them, but if you do, then everything looks a bit too blurry, so I don't quite like that effect. So put this one on none and the other one on 8x. Although, again, this is just a visual, so if you have a low-end PC, feel free to go into the URP, and over here, disable anti-aliasing. So the game looks a bit worse, but it will run much better. Okay, let's drag the scale back down, okay. Now, one final thing we can add is some really nice screen space ambient occlusion. For that, let's go into the renderer, so not the render pipeline asset, the renderer. And over here, by default, it already added screen space ambient occlusion. If it didn't add, you can click on add renderer feature, and over here, you won't be able to see it. I don't see it because I already have it. Okay, so here it is. Basically, what this effect does is it adds some tiny shadows where geometry intersects. If we enable and disable it quickly, we can see the effect over there on the counters. So you can see with the default effects, it already works quite nicely. For example, look at that on the player. We can barely see the difference between the head and the body, but if we enable this, it adds that nice little shadow. I think it looks really nice. But then we've got a bunch of settings we can play around, increase the intensity, the radius, and so on. Now, one important thing when setting all of these effects is to remember the point of view of the camera. In this case, we're making a top-down game. So before we play around with these settings, let's actually position the camera in a correct position. So let's go ahead, select the main camera, and let's position it above pointing down. So let's put it on an X of 0, on a Y of 21.5, on a Z of minus 21.3, then for the rotation on the X 46, then 0 and 0. And finally on the camera over here on the field of view, instead of 60, that's really wide. For this game, let's go with 20. Okay, so this is the view that we're going to use for our game. Let me just rotate the objects so they actually face the camera. So on the hierarchy, let's just select all the objects. Let's rotate them all around and just position them. Again, we're only using these just to see what they'll look like. We're going to delete all of these objects in a bit. Okay, so yep, that's the game view. Now that we have the camera set up, let's work on the settings for the ambient occlusion. So let's go down, select the renderer, and over here for the settings. For the intensity, let's put it on 4. For the radius, let's put it at 0.3. And direct lighting strength, let's put it all the way up to 1. Okay, so you can toggle this, enable and disable to see the difference, and yep, I do think these settings look pretty good. Finally, the last thing we need to check is the lighting window. So let's go into window, then down into rendering, and let's go into lighting. Out pops up the lighting window. Personally, I like to anchor it over there next to the inspector. And over here, we're really going to leave everything on defaults. So you can leave it as the lighting settings assets and nothing assigned. And then on the environment tab, over here, again, all of the defaults, I didn't touch any of these. So we've got environment lighting from the skybox, intensity multiplier of 1. So everything pretty much on defaults. Although again, like I said, most of these visual effects are very much personal preference. So if you want to make your game look a bit different than mine, then go ahead. You can play around with lighting over here. You can change skybox to gradient color and so on. If you want, you can use some baked lighting. Then if you want, you can add all kinds of extra effects. And also, by the way, remember that the effects are stored on this profile over here. So for example, you can click over here on the clone button and it will clone the effect. So let's click on it to find it. Yep, there you go. So that's the one that I built and here's a clone one. So if you want, you can make a clone one and then make it look very different. For example, let's go into chromatic aberration, make it really intense. And for example, let's go into the color curves. And over here, for some reason, let's drag the green up and so on. So there you go, completely different visual. So if you want, play around, make some weird effects. And if you want to go back, just revert back into the original profile. Personally, I'm quite happy with how this looks, so I'm going to be using this one, okay? Again, you can enable and disable the volume game object to see quite the big difference that post-processing makes. If you ever want to make your game look quite a lot better, always make sure to add some post-processing. Alright, so like I said, this looks really good. I like it. Now, before we go to the next lecture, let's just clean this up. So let's get rid of all of these objects. So the counter, cabbage, tomato, and so on. Let's get rid of all of them except the floor. So let's leave the floor and get rid of all of these. Alright, so here we have our nice empty scene. Let's just save our scene and let's get ready for the next lecture. Hi there, this is a quick intermission. So how are you doing? Are you enjoying the course so far? Are you having any trouble with anything? Is there something you didn't understand? If so, remember I'm always active in the comments answering all the questions. So if there's anything you need some extra clarification, go ahead and ask and I'll do my best to help. Also remember to check out the pinned comment. YouTube videos cannot be updated, so for any notes or comments, I'll put them in the pinned comment. And definitely check out the website page for this course. As people ask more and more questions, I will keep that page updated with any frequently asked questions for every single lecture, so that way you can see what others have asked and learn from them. And you can also download the project files for each lecture, so keep that page open on a second tab and check it every time you start watching a new lecture. I really hope you're enjoying the course, and I hope you've already learned quite a few things. Go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Okay, so let's go to the next lecture. Hello and welcome, I'm your Code Monkey. In this lecture we're going to begin creating our character. Let's make a nice character controller so we can move our character in the world. Okay, so first let's begin by creating the character game object. And now, usually, most beginner tutorials would tell you to just right-click, go into 3D object and create something like a capsule. That way you would have the game object with the visual included. However, for a good project structure and good organization, you should always separate the visuals from the logic. For example, here, let's say that I don't want my capsule exactly like this. Let's say that I want my player to be a little bit more skinny. To do that, I would have to modify the scale on this game object. So put it maybe on 0.7, so something like this. Basically, by doing that, by modifying the visual, I also modified the scale on the actual player game object. Having a non-uniform scale on a logic game object, that can cause all kind of problems with any kind of logic component. Also, I would prefer to have my character on the floor, but if I put it on y of 0, notice how the character is half underneath the floor. So if I were to use this method, I would have to apply some kind of offset in order to make the visual above the floor. So that would require rearranging all the logic to work with an offset on the y position. So because of those reasons and many more, you should not place both the logic and the visual on the same game object. Instead, you should separate them. So let's get rid of this, and instead, let's create an empty game object. Let's name this the player. Let's put it on 0, 0, 0, okay? And now inside of it, let's create, let's say, a capsule. Now in this one, we can easily scale this to get any size and shape you want. So for example, 0.7, 0.7. Then since the visual is a child of the game object, we can also easily offset this. So let's say put it up by about 1 unit. So with this, we can position the visual so that basically the player game object is over here on 0, 0 and the character is above the floor. So we don't have any weird offsets. This will make all of our logic much more simplified. And now on this empty parent game object, we can attach all of the logic components we want. And then in the child visual, we can add or replace whatever visuals we want. So as a general rule, you should always try to do this. Always separate the logic from the visuals in your game object. Okay, so with that we have the player game object. Now let's make our character controller script. And before we do, let's keep things once again organized. So before we do, let's create a brand new folder. So let's right click on the assets, create a brand new folder, call it scripts. And now inside, let's right click and create a new C# script, call it the player. Wait for the code to compile, then select the player game object and attach the script. Again, remember logic components go on the parent game object, not the child visual. So the child visual, this one only has visual components, and the player, this is the one that actually has the logic components. So let's open up this script. Okay, so here's our first C# script. Like I said, I'm going to assume you know the absolute basics. Go watch the C# basics video if you haven't seen it yet. So I will assume that you know what is a function, what is a variable, what is start and update, so pretty much the absolute basics. For a character controller, we first need some input from the player. And for that, Unity actually has two methods. You have the legacy input manager and the new input system. Basically, the legacy input manager is super simple and very easy to use, so this one is perfect for quickly prototyping. And the new input system is extremely capable with tons of features, but it's also a bit more complex. So what I do is while I'm doing a simple demo or testing out a new prototype, I just use the legacy input manager, but when making a more complex project, like for example my Steam game, then at a certain point I refactor my code to use the new input system. So here I'm going to teach you both, as well as teaching you how to refactor code, which is an extremely useful skill. So let's first begin by using the simple legacy input manager. We want some basic WASD movement to move our character, and we're going to need to run that logic on every single frame, so let's do it on update. And let's actually get rid of the code that Unity writes by default. Let's start completely from scratch, so let's get rid of this, just close, okay. So here, let's start by writing private void update. And now here, very important, if you're a beginner, make sure that update is written exactly like this. If you write update with lowercase, if you do this, then it won't work. The function will not be called automatically. I'm pointing this out